Hello, upper cervical doctors and students, and welcome back to the UCM Podcast. I am Dr. Bill Davis, your host for today, and I have a fantastic guest back on the podcast, one of the top upper cervical doctors in the profession. Dr. Kyle Konas is back on the podcast. Dr. Kyle, I am thrilled to have you back. Welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much, Doc. Excited to be here again. It's going to be great.
Cool. Man, got so much to talk to you about. As I was saying, I think I could talk to you for about 2 or 3 hours, but we're going to keep this to around 30 minutes, and we're going to make this happen for these docs and get right dialed in on what we want to talk about today. But for anybody out there that doesn't know you, Doc, can you please just share a little bit of your intro?
Yeah, certainly. Dr. Kyle Konas, upper cervical doc. We practice orthospinalogy as our upper cervical technique. I have been in practice almost 6.5 years. I opened right out of school, graduated December 2017, opened our practice in Traverse City, Michigan, June of 18. So yeah, we're coming up on that 6.5 year mark. Been blessed to grow quickly and fast and learn a lot. I like to say I've actually had 6.5 years of practice in 6.5 years where it hasn't been the same year repeated over 6 years, right? So I've experienced a lot of different things. Have 3 associates, 11 support staff, and been blessed to grow every year over year so far. So,
yeah. So this is a doc who has figured out a lot of things very quickly. That's how I have described Dr. Kyle Konas to others. He has figured a lot of things out really quickly that many docs it can take them decades or they never figure it out. And so I'd love to get into some of these specifics with you about what this journey's been like for you in these last 6.5 years to go from zero to moving towards a $3 million practice, which is where you're moving towards, which is absolutely phenomenal. Like I said, rare air within chiropractic and especially within upper cervical to get to that level of practice. And so let's talk about, one of the things that you and I, as we were getting ready for this, we discussed the specialization that you had very early on with your CAs to really get them dialed into their different roles. And because, when you're collecting the amount that you're collecting with 3 doctors, you're not seeing patients. You're a clinic director, right? You're just directing the clinic at this point. Yeah. Your CAs have to be dialed in and they have to be really locked into systems and be able to really support the doctors to be able to see this many patients. And so let's talk about that. What is the specialization that you've been able to do with your CAs and how has that helped you grow?
Yeah, it's a great question. When we first opened, I'll say we didn't have that as part of our practice. Some of the coaching that I had previously or systems that I'd learned coming through school was more of just the general CA model, and everyone's just fully cross-trained, and every day they could be working the front desk or they could be, helping with a new patient exam, anything in between. So pretty quickly, I learned that it made a lot more sense to specialize those roles. Just as I think the doc should specialize in doctor activities. We don't need the doctors on the phone or working the front desk. That's not their best use of time. And we want people to be experts in what they do every single day. And so obviously front desk is an obvious one. But even within front desk, we actually have ours divided up into front desk new patient liaison and front desk established patient liaison. Yes, of course, they're both cross-trained. They both function as a unit. But even just, and let me say this too, part of the specialization that's really nice is that you now have accountability within your organization at every department. So if you split your organization into departments from like an org chart standpoint, and you have, like your day 1, day 2, that's your sales process. We call people who do those for us case managers. It's essentially what they are is salespeople at the end of the day. In chiropractic, we have to do sales, right? We got to educate people and get them to buy what we're selling. So, Lord knows pharma's doing it, so we got to do it.
Yeah. That's right.
So you got that, you've got your front desk system, but at the end of the day, if everyone's a jack of all trades and they're each doing everything, there's no one to go to at the end of the day if there's a problem and say, hey, what happened here? Who's responsible for this? It
Mm.
becomes very easy for people to point the finger. Oh, I thought they were doing it. I thought they were doing it. So creating that specialization, number one, helps with accountability. Number two, helps them become an expert in their role. So everything from front desk to case managers, we have an exam specialist who does, bulk of our re-exams and things like that. A lot of our notes. Associates are mainly, just doing doctor activities. I do have a director of operations at this point who was originally my office manager. And then I had to promote her to director of operations once we got so big that I needed multiple levels of leadership. So now I have a director of operations and an office manager to help divvy those duties up because our practice got too big for one person to carry that full load. So
yeah, that's awesome. So I want to talk more about your case managers because I think that that's a really important role. We call it new patient coordinators, right? The same idea here, right? Though is someone that handles the entire new patient journey, right? Starting from now, does your case managers, do they do the initial phone call with the new patient, or is your front desk doing that?
They can. Most every staff member in my office is trained on the phones, and so it's kind of an all hands on deck.
Available.
Yep, exactly.
Gotcha. So they're all following the same basic protocol for a new patient phone call, regardless of which one of them's doing it.
They are. And just on a side note, we also record all of our phone calls, and they're audited by my director of operations for quality. And so she can flag those phone calls. She can send them back to the person who did it with notes saying, hey, next time they ask this, answer it this way, and those type of things. So that's a good opportunity for training and quality assurance.
Absolutely. This is something that we've implemented with our clients in the last few years. Every one of our client phone calls, new patient phone calls is recorded, and it's an absolute must. I mean, I cannot tell you how many times we've seen that dramatically improve an office just by recording new patient phone calls and then actually listening to them and then training on that. It's an amazing thing. This is why, every place you ever call, this call is being recorded for quality. There's a reason for that, right? Because it works. This is how you get better on the phones.
Yeah, 100%. It's just like you might record a day one and a day two to get better at it. You should do the same exact thing on your phones, because if your phones are weak, well, guess what? You're never going to see them for a day one, day two. So it's top. It's towards the top of the funnel there. So you got to make sure that that's fixed and not leaking.
Yep. So new patient phone call, dialed in, get them scheduled. And then once they're scheduled, that's when the case manager essentially takes over. Is that right?
Yes. Yep. So case manager, effectively what they're responsible for is, greeting the patient once they show up to the office, brief office tour, getting them in an exam room, doing the consultation, and the portion of the exam that the case manager can do, which would be things like range of motion. We do vitals, posture screen, so a posture assessment. So they can do all those kind of things that are not needed by a doctor. And so they're doing
the basic consultation as well.
They are. Yep. They're doing the consultation. So in my mind, because the way we work that, then the doctor will come in during the day one. Once the case manager will finish their portion, they'll step out, grab a doctor, debrief the doctor on the consultation. Obviously, doctor can ask any clarifying questions. And then if they need to go in and ask more clarifying questions to the patient, they have the opportunity to do that. But that's where the doctor will come in and do any, do spinal exam, any orthos they might want to do. They'll do their own visual posture assessment just to match it with the posture screen that we take, and then order x-rays from there. And so then the case manager can take the x-rays, get them scheduled for the day two. And then on day two, the doctor always starts that portion and does all the clinical section, x-ray review. We also have them get frequency commitment on the care plan. So if we need to see them, twice a week or whatever that is, the doctor's getting that commitment and driving home the importance of frequency in their care. And then from there, they step out and it's handed back to that same case manager to essentially go through the care plan and the recommendations and go through all the finances, get payment, all the, cross the T's, dot the I's. So for me, part of the reason I like the case manager doing the consultation is that they now have that rapport and they have all the insights to the patient in terms of, their why and what makes them tick and why they're here. So that way, if it does get to the financial side and it's, well, yeah, I think I'm going to have to think about this. Well, that's, I guess I'm just a little confused here, Bill. Yesterday you said this would mean the world to you and it was everything to get this problem fixed. And now you're saying you have to think about it. So, what help me bridge the gap there? What's going on? And if you didn't do the consultation and you're now presenting the finances, you're going to have a lot harder time being able to go back to their values that you established in the consultation to be able to play off those and try to get to the bottom of what's going on.
So talk to doctors out there who their minds are blown by this, right? Like that. You mean the doctor doesn't do the initial consultation? I can't, they can't wrap their mind around that. So, what did it take to get your case managers to the point where they were able to do consultations? What sort of training do you put into them in order to be able to do a consultation effectively and the other tasks that they need to do as a case manager or new patient coordinator?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, training. We have 2 different training blocks every single week for my whole team that are designated. We train for a half hour Tuesdays and an hour on Wednesdays. So it's an hour and a half minimum that everybody's training every week, right? So you have to be training your team constantly. Number 2, another way that you really want to do this is, number 1, standardize it. We'll probably get into more of this as we talk about scaling in this conversation.
Yeah.
Like, everything has to be documented and easily trainable. And you have to remember that simple scales and complexity will kill you. So I also think as doctors, we're going to have some ego, and we have to realize like we're not all geniuses at everything. And so we have to realize only I can do the consultation. Only I can do the report of findings. Only I can do this. Well, I hate to break it to you, but you're not that special. So there are people that are as smart as you that you can train to do things that you think you have to do. And possibly they're going to be even better than you if that's not your innate strengths or strong suit. So one thing, I'll just put a quick plug in for Trainual. Trainual is a platform. I'm not affiliated with them. I have no vested interest in the company, but I love their product. It's an online training platform you can build curriculum into. And I've spent probably over 100 hours in the last 2 years building online training portal curriculum for my team, for every role, for everything we do in the office. So complete with videos, SOPs, scripts. In Trainual, you can even build tests at the end. So I have modules on like every process and function of our office. And at the end, there's a quiz that's anywhere from 15 to 50 questions. And the team, I can see all their progress. They have to get 100% on these quizzes to be able to complete the module and move on. So everything is documented, it's standardized, and we train the heck out of everything. And so you have to do that if you are going to delegate certain things.
Yeah, that's awesome. So when it comes to hiring case managers, what sort of things do you look for to make sure that they have the right personality type, the right characteristics, and so forth that are going to thrive in this role?
Yeah. So generally, you're going to want someone who's a little more extroverted because they're going to be talking to people all day long. So even if they're an introvert that can fake it, they're probably not going to last in that role because they're going to get burnt out. They're going to get burnt out. So first of all, personality type, you want someone who's extroverted, and then someone who frankly is not afraid of money, right? Like if you're presenting care plans and hopefully charging your value, then these care plans are going to cost a good chunk of money. And if you're hiring someone who, first of all, has never sold anything, so like sales experience is big, and then someone who has maybe a bad relationship themselves with money, that's going to be a limiting belief for them, even if it's subconscious when they're in the room there. So we look for sales experience. We look for someone who's a little more extroverted. Obviously, just like anyone on our team, we'd love to have someone who's health-minded and natural health conscious. And then obviously just like emotional intelligence is really the big thing. That's what it comes down to. If you can sit down from someone and within 2 minutes connect with them, and just them being able to feel how much you care about them and feel your empathy, that's the most important thing. And then all of those extra things are bonuses. So
that's awesome. So you mentioned, scaling, and I want to shift the conversation into that direction because, as you said, that the specialization has become even more important as you scaled, right? As you've moved up in the practice and gone for the different practice growth stages. And so, an area where we see a lot of doctors kind of get to the point where they build up their practice, not usually as quickly as you have, but they build their practice to $1 million practice, right? That's definitely a gold standard within chiropractic, right? I've got $1 million practice, right? But going from $1 million practice to a $2 million practice, right? Doubling that practice again is what I've seen very difficult. It's something that doctors are not able to do very frequently, and many doctors never get to that point in their career. And so I'd love to talk about, because you've done this over the past few years. You've gone from $1 million practice to a $2 million practice and are now moving towards a $3 million practice. So what have been the keys at going in this step that you've taken from the $1 million to the $2 million practice?
Yes. The easy answer here, that's by far the biggest answer, is delegation. And I think 98% of the time, the practice owner is the bottleneck of growth of the practice. So I'll say that again, 98% of the time, you listening to this, the owner, you are the bottleneck. You are the reason it's not growing. And it's not because you're doing anything poorly other than not giving stuff off your plate. So most likely the practice owner's plate is too full. You then become the bottleneck and it limits your growth to a large degree. So when it comes to, some action steps around that, like first thing I would encourage someone to do, if you feel stuck, if your practice hasn't grown in 6 to 12 months, do a time study. So do a time study on your time, like buy every 15-minute block for a week or two, and look at that and see how you're spending your time, right? There's administrative tasks you could be doing. There's, technical tasks, there's self-care, there's high leverage CEO tasks you may be doing. So there's all these different type of tasks. And then in a nutshell, what you want to do is label those tasks, right? There's things that are easy to do. There's things that are hard to do. There's things that are very important for the business and things that are not very important for the business. And so you can start to categorize those things, right? Like something that's not important, not largely important for the practice and is easy to do, get those off your plate immediately, right? Like those are the first things you should be delegating. In order to delegate effectively, though, you have to have, like I mentioned earlier, systems and documentation in place. So if you don't have things documented, that's actually where you need to start first, because you're not going to be able to hand it off. If everything resides in your head, that's going to be a bottleneck right there, because people can't pull that out of you, and you're always going to be needed for questions. So to find too where some of those processes may lie, like you may have to test it a little bit if you're kind of unsure. So a good litmus test to kind of see like the scalability of your practice and how much it really depends on you versus is it an actual business or is it just a job you've created, right? Like how long can you not show up to the practice and not have production drop? That's the real litmus test. Can you not show up for a day and practice doesn't do any less production? Can you not show up for 2 days? Can you not show up for a week? Can you not show up for 2 weeks? Can you not show up for a month? And you just keep pushing that envelope. And that's really like your own litmus test of how scalable your practice is and have you actually nailed the model. And so, looking at that, looking at your daily activities and just figuring out what can you get off your plate, what can you delegate, and then hire and train the right people to do that. And having said that, you can't be scared of overhead or investing in team. Like I've talked to a lot of doctors that are, your overhead's that much? Oh, that's crazy. I would never want that big of an overhead. It's like, okay, well, talk to any big business. Go ask Amazon how much their overhead is. Would you want to own Amazon? Oh, you would? Well, then I guess overhead's not the problem, right? Like profits are the problem. So if you have 140K overhead and you're collecting $240 a month, like would you take 100K profit a month with that overhead? I probably would. So it's interesting sometimes how we think about business, and people who have a 40K overhead and are collecting 60 a month are too scared to have a 140K overhead, but they could be collecting 240 with that. So I think wrapping your head around that your team is an investment, just as you're going to invest money in your retirement account or in real estate or anywhere else. Like, you invest in team members that you hire, and then team members are never an expense. Team members are always an investment. As long as you train them right and you onboard them properly, they should pay dividends for your practice. And the bigger you get, the better people you need to hire around you. And just to kind of close that loop, also make sure that you're hiring your weaknesses. Like, if you don't know yourself, you haven't done a strength finders assessment, you haven't done personality assessments, like your office manager, your operator, we like to call them, if they're not covering your weaknesses, you're going to be in some trouble. So if you're like a strong visionary, you have all these great ideas, but you lack attention to detail and lack, getting things done and all the fine points in between, hire that person. Like, there's someone out there that's great at that would love to do that for you. And so you got to know yourself so that you can put those right people around you.
I love that. I want to dive in a little bit more on something you just mentioned, which is overhead, right? And understanding overhead percentages and these types of things in order as you scale, right? Because I know that can be an issue as well, right? When you get to the place, we have a doctor who we were talking with recently, and their overhead was 91%. That's a practice that's not going to make it very long, right? And so you have to be very careful about this overhead creep. So talk about that. Talk about, some of those overhead percentages and some of those things that you have really been, dialing in and focusing on as you've scaled as well.
Yeah, certainly. So we like to call those profit levers, right? Like, there's certain levers you don't want to violate in order to have a scalable business. And I'll say too, like, anyone listening, take some of this in context, because a 1 doc 2 employee office is going to be very different than a 3 doc 10 employee office in terms of overhead percentages. And, some of them are the same, but a lot of those are going to change. And so, like, you should have a bigger percentage margin when you're small than when you're big. I just brought up Amazon. Like, guess what? They're not running like a 40% margin because they're freaking huge, but they're doing billions of dollars a year. So if they have a 2% margin, that's millions and millions of profit, right? So just keep that in mind. So I think when you're a small practice, shooting for like a 40%, even 50% margin is super doable and great. And that's awesome. I think kind of the last benchmark as you get really large is maintaining like a 20% margin would be the biggest, especially, like someone in my shoes who I'm not even at the practice or involved in the day-to-day, I'm paying people now to essentially do my job I was doing. So you got to account for some of that, but that allows me to free up my time and then move on to the next endeavor that I want to dive into. So a couple big ones I would watch out for. One is marketing spend. So your overall marketing budget. So this is anything you spend on marketing, not just your ad spend, like everything you're spending. Ideally for me, I like to be 10 to 12% of my collections should be going towards my marketing. Okay. So, and that's like a fairly aggressive growth percentage. Another good one you can look at is roughly 19%. My goal is 19% of our collection should be going to pay support staff. 20% going to pay providers. Okay. So those are kind of some general benchmarks there you can shoot for. So all you have to do is pull up your profit and loss statement, look at your collections, and then look at that line item on your profit and loss and just see like where you stacking up on some of those. Another one I like is trying to get your new patient acquisition costs to about 5% of your average case value. So what that would mean is average case value we define as the average amount of an initial care plan in your practice. Okay. So different than lifetime value, but just initial case value.
Sure.
If your new patient acquisition costs, you can get to 5% or less of that amount. Like that's a very scalable model to reproduce. So That's another one you can look at to see how efficient your marketing is. But yeah, I don't want to go too crazy with numbers, but like, if you don't know your numbers, like you're not going to have a scalable business. So all your numbers you should know, like you should know number of scheduled new patients, number of completed new patients. Therefore, you now know your new patient show rate. What is your start rate on your day twos? What is your churn rate? What percent of your practice is turning over? What's your average case value? What's your lifetime value? Your new patient acquisition cost? There's a million that you could go into and track, but those are all things that you want to be aware of and look at. And it also allows you then to know where are the leaky holes in the bucket that you actually need to fix. So
yeah, that's awesome.
We typically, just to round that out, one thing that's helped us and I think helped to make us more scalable is every quarter we are picking one problem, right? Like if you've read Traction or things like that, like we take one rock, if you will, like that's what they call it in Traction, but we just pick one process for the quarter that we're going to put all of our energy and focus into and try to improve. So that could be start rate, could be scheduled new patients, could be re-sign percentage, like whatever that is. If you're tracking these numbers, you can see which ones, hey, if I got this from, 70% to 76, let's do the math. And what would that do to our overall collections and profitability? Yep. And then you can actually put that in place and put all your energy and focus for 3 months on that so that it's truly fixed, and then move on to the next thing you can improve.
That's awesome. So, I mean, this is crucial stuff. Like this, if you're at that $1 million level, these are the kind of things you need to be thinking about, right? You need to be thinking about your numbers like this. You need to be able to break these down the way that Kyle is breaking them down. You have to be able to understand like the value of every team member and what they're bringing to the practice and how they're the investment that you've made into them is producing, right? Is it producing the fruit that you're expecting it to, right? Like all of this stuff has to be dialed in if you're going to be able to go. And I thought it something else that was really, really crucial. What you said is overhead can go up. I mean, overhead can increase as you scale, and that's okay, right? So many times we talk with doctors that we're just trying to get them to do the first step of hiring their very first associate, right? And at that point, we'd like to see, like you mentioned, a 50% overhead, right? Like if you can be at around a 50% overhead when you hire that first associate, you're going to be in a much better position when you're bringing on your highest paid team member, right? But as you scale up and as you add multiple doctors and multiple CAs and your overall revenue number is much higher, your overhead can creep up. You just don't want it to be at 91%.
Correct.
Right. That's not a scalable business model. But like you said, when you're not in the practice at all, like you are, and you get to that place, a 20% overhead, I mean, a 20% profit margin is okay at that point, right? With an 80% overhead. Right. That's something that's important to point out. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about that we had mentioned is, I mean, obviously you've got a super dialed in practice right now, single location practice, right? 3 doctors, 10.5 CAs, rocking and rolling in this practice. What has, what for you haven't gone to a second location yet. Now, also I wanted to mention about Dr. Kyle is he is in a rural area, right? He's in an area that is a small area, right? This isn't like, he's not doing this in New York City or something, right? This is a small rural area. So, just because you're in a small market doesn't mean you can't grow a great practice, right? That's something I wanted to point out here as well. But for you, what's gone into the decision at this point to have just a single location? I know that in the future you're thinking about moving to in multiple locations, but what are some of the factors that you have brought into that decision?
Yeah, it's a great question. First of all, so like you mentioned, that's our next step here, and part of why it's really nice for me to be out of the day-to-day. And I still go into my practice Tuesdays and Wednesdays for meetings, like with my team, with my director of ops, my office manager, my associates, team training, things like that. But I'm just in there only those 2 days. So what that allows me to do now is free me up to go to the next step and the next level, which for us is going to be multi-location. But I was very cautious of doing that too fast. And again, that litmus test I mentioned earlier, like if you can't leave your practice for 2 to 4 weeks without production dropping more than a point or two, then it's not running by itself. So how then can we turn our attention away from that to go do something else when this isn't rock solid and stable? And then part of my personality, just because I'm very analytical and I look at things, there's always stuff going on with that location that I always think can be better. So I actually have to be careful of not being too perfectionist and being like, all right, this is pretty darn good. I can probably move on to the next thing. But part of that has allowed me to really dial it in before I jump to the next endeavor prematurely. And then I just want to make sure that like the model is fully automatic and fully scalable before we go and try to duplicate it elsewhere. If you're duplicating a broken model, you're just going to be doubling the problems that you already have. So for me, it's just making sure that was totally, functional as it was, doesn't need me there at all to continue to run and function well. And then again, making sure you have the right people in the right place with enough tenure that can tackle problems when they come up without me having to get involved. And so just making sure you have the right team in place that's going to be able to support you as well.
Yeah, I love that. And this is what we tell docs all the time who want to go to multiple locations. You are starting a second business, right? It's 100%. You have to be able to focus in on it like you did your original location. You have to, and like you said, if you have to be in your original location all the time, it's going to be very difficult to open a second location, right?
Yep.
It's when you get to the place where you're out of the practice, you're only there for trainings and those types of things, then you can actually focus on building a second business, which is what it would be, right? It's a completely different market. It's completely different things. You're going to take a scalable business model that's working in one location, and you're going to apply it in another location, but it's going to be a new business, right? Every new place that you're running something is new. And so understanding that and being able to step into that with that amount of, eyes wide open and saying, okay, this is going to take work, right? I'm going to have to put energy into this to make this second location work. It's not just going to work automatically because the first location's working, right?
Yeah, exactly. And having that automated training process in place, like I mentioned, like everything's documented.
Huge. Yeah.
They can log into the training portal and do their case managers can do their day 1 and day 2 training on there. People can log on and do phones training. Doctors can log on and do training on their clinical stuff that I've built out. So having resources like that created, like those are high leverage activities that you should be working on as the CEO of the business. And so when you do that time study that I mentioned earlier, like pay attention to that. What percentage of these activities I'm doing are high leverage? And by high leverage, I mean, you're going to get way more out of it a year from now than what you're putting in at the current moment. So if you're adjusting all day long, that's great. Awesome. Love adjusting. But if you adjust, 50, 100 people today, how much leverage does that give you for tomorrow? Zero. Right. You're starting back at square one at zero tomorrow. If I put 3 hours into building this, sales training platform today, how much leverage does that give me a year from now? Well, a bunch, because I no longer have to sit down knee to knee with every new employee that I hire to use my time to train them. Now it's all documented. So just a little pro tip on that too. Here's an easy way to start. Whenever you're training your team on anything, get a camera out and record it. Like it's such an easy thing to do that a lot of people are not doing. And you do the same trainings over and over and over. So why not just record yourself doing it once so you actually free up your own time in the future? And now that recording can just be watched and emulated that way.
Yep, 100%. So I love this conversation. Like I said, I'd love to talk to you longer, but we want to wrap this up. Your time's valuable, and so is our listeners. And so, is there anything else, Dr. Kyle, before we wrap up for today that you'd like to share with the doctors and students that are listening?
Let's see. I think get your vision clear. Like have your vision, your end goal in mind as you design your practice. I think a lot of times we make, and I'm super guilty of this. I've done it 100 times, which is why I know we make a more short-sighted decision for what's going to be easiest in the short term rather than doing the hard work now to make life easier in the long term. You kind of mentioned it, hiring your first associate, right? Like in the short term, that could suck for a few months, because guess what?
Yeah.
They're not going to be super productive the first few months as you train them and as you get your patient base bigger. Yeah, that sucks. Like, it's not easy and it's not fun for a couple months. But guess what that looks like a year from now or 2 years from now? So it's about doing the hard stuff now so that you can make your life easier in the future, instead of continuing to do the easy now where you're just going to continue hard stuff, make your life harder in the future. So think about that when you're making decisions. Do your time study, see where most of your time is going and how much is actually spent to that. And then last tip I'll get for that time study and choosing what to get off your plate. Figure out how much money you make, like personally, like what do you take home from the business? Divide that by how many hours you work, just a guesstimate. If you can hire someone for a quarter of that amount or less to do any of the activities that you're currently doing, then hire them tomorrow and get that done. So if you make $200 an hour and you can pay someone less than $50 to do something that you're doing, go ahead and do that and do more of your $200 activities, because that's what's going to scale, actually allow you to scale into the future.
Love it. Love it. Thank you, Doc, again for being on the podcast. As usual, brought incredible value. Appreciate you so much. And as we always say, go team upper cervical.
Thanks, Doc.